I started the Real Mental podcast because it bugs me when film and TV miss the mark about how mental health gets portrayed. Real Mental is a podcast where a film-loving psychiatrist, that's me, talks to a film critic to help people figure out their lives by getting to the truth about mental health in the movies. Welcome, Adam Manery, to the Real Mental podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me again.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And we're going to talk about a film I really enjoyed. It's a very interesting film. And I think we'll have lots of good content to discuss in this film when it comes to mental health. But why don't you start by introducing yourself again for the listeners and tell them about who you are, what you do, and then we'll jump into the film.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, my name is Adam Manery. I have an independent outlet called Points of Review, where I write or talk about various films that interest me on my website and also on YouTube. I used to be a high school English teacher, but kind of transitioned to this world of film. So, yeah, super happy to talk about one of my favorite films, quite honestly, of the past several years.
Wow. So
Mhm.
let's talk about Perfect Days. And why was it one of your favorite films of the past several years?
So, Perfect Days was essentially made for me and what I look for in a film. It comes from the brilliant director Wim Wenders. And on the surface, it is a project, it is a film that is not doing too much. The plot is very simple. It's not about hitting all of these traditional Hollywood beats. It's very much a film about listening, about watching, about being still. And it doesn't hurt that it has my favorite soundtrack of the last couple of years.
Okay, well, that's a good beginning. So, why don't you give the setting, the scene, and the characters a little bit so that the
Mhm.
listener can get a sense of, where we're located and who is the main character and, what they do.
Yeah, so we essentially follow a man by the name of Hirayama, played by Koji Yakusho, as a toilet cleaner in Tokyo. We essentially progress through this film watching his daily routine as he gets up in the morning, trims his mustache, washes his face, tends to his bonsai, stops at the vending machine, goes to work, cleans toilets, stops for lunch to look at the trees and take some photos, returns home, reads a book, goes to sleep, and then essentially repeats that through the film. We are introduced to some other characters that appear for moments, but are a little bit fleeting. It really is about Koji Yakusho's character, but we're introduced to his younger coworker who is perhaps not as dedicated to the job of cleaning toilets. We're introduced to that young man's love interest who kind of takes a shared interest in music with Hirayama. We also meet Hirayama's niece who bonds with him and kind of shares her experiences with him. We meet his sister briefly, who he no longer is in much communication with, and a fleeting love interest. And really, we just follow this character day in and day out.
Yeah, absolutely. And, when I was watching it, the first thing I noticed is, okay, here's his day. And then next scene, here's his day again. And then here's his day again with very little variation. And
Mhm.
I'm going, okay, so what's the filmmaker doing? They're giving us a sense that this is very much a routine that is unchanging. And the other thing I thought that was very interesting was that this is a man who's cleaning toilets, and yet he, like you say, he has some very interesting hobbies. He nurtures bonsai trees. He has a whole little garden of them in his little apartment, and he reads very, serious literature, and he listens to very good, interesting music.
Yes.
So he has these hobbies. Oh, and he takes photographs.
Hmm.
And the interesting thing is, he always takes photographs of the leaves on the trees and the
Hmm.
sky. So even his hobbies are very kind of circumspect or constrained.
Hmm.
But it's very interesting because he's deep on one level. He's got depth. He's
Hmm.
intellectual and he has interests, but he doesn't have any friends. He has a woman he was watching, but he doesn't pursue, right? He doesn't pursue relationships. Relationships happen,
Hmm.
accidentally, incidentally, and he is kind, but he does not pursue connection, right? He has the guy who serves him at his local eatery, and the guy knows his order and just brings him his food and his beer, but he doesn't have a relationship with anyone. So I started thinking, like, what's with this man, right? What's the story here? That's what I kept asking. I'm a
Hmm.
psychiatrist. So what's the
Yeah.
story here?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he's such a fascinating character in so many ways, right? Because he appears to be a certain kind of person on the surface, but then when you slowly peel these layers away, you realize that there is actually a lot more that maybe he isn't saying directly, but the film is kind of nudging you towards. And a lot of this character, I think, can be explored through the lens of kind of Eastern versus Western cultures and the way that we, as Westerners, might look at this individual and this repetition and how seemingly monotonous this life is, and perhaps think to ourselves, why would anyone live in this way that seems to be so constrained? But if we allow ourselves to kind of examine Perfect Days and this character through that Eastern lens, it opens his character up in a lot of interesting ways. So I think that is a good kind of general way to view this film, just kind of bearing in mind these Eastern and Western kind of viewpoints, the way that we tend to see the world.
That's so right on, because I started thinking that the structure of the movie felt like a meditation.
Hmm.
And Hirayama's life really felt like he was a monk. He was doing his daily ritual, and the toilet cleaning he took so seriously. And he really took pride in his work. And he was so devoted to making these absolutely spotless toilets. And yet he had a playful side. He had a tic tac toe game with someone who left a tic tac toe for him to fill out. And he went back and forth with this total anonymous person, and they played a game together, right? He would
Hmm.
make an X and the other person would make their O. And, they never met, but they played a game together. So he's playful, but he struck me as kind of a monk. Like he chose this monastic life, but not living in a monastery. Did it strike you that way too?
A little bit, yeah. I think that, again, on the surface, he appears to have this almost absolute stoicism in the way that he approaches life, which I don't think is entirely accurate. As we kind of progress through the film, we see that perhaps that is not the full picture. But yeah, I think that his approach to life is just finding the beauty, finding the joy in those little things. And like a monk, not living a life of excess. You can see in his home, for example, that he only has the things that bring him direct joy and purpose and fulfillment. And even in the way that he speaks or the way that he chooses not to speak, also kind of illustrates that restraint and that understanding that he only needs to put out or seek kind of what he needs and nothing more. So there's definitely some parallels there.
Yeah. So his life goes on and it's the same routine. And then there are things that happen that kind of interfere with his routine or
Hmm.
jar him. So, like you said, the first thing that happens is he has his coworker who's kind of a ne'er-do-well, and he's sort of lazy and he's, irresponsible. And he brings this girl and he actually steals one of Hirayama's prized cassettes and puts it in the girl's purse as like a gift, except it's stolen. And then, he needs money to take out his girlfriends. So he tries to make Hirayama sell his cassettes. And instead, Hirayama lends him money, which he never gets back. And then the guy quits. Right. And so he's out of all this money. And of course, he quits without notice. So Hirayama has to do all his work that day, too. And he's not pleased. So that kind of throws him for a loop. And then the
Mhm.
girl shows up and she gives him back the tape and then listens to it one more time and then kisses him, which he has this very interesting reaction to. It's almost like he's like shocked. Right. What did
Mhm.
you make of that?
Yeah, all of these supporting characters, I think, serve such direct and clear purpose, which is really a testament to Benders and Takuma Takasaki, who co-wrote the film. They all very clearly illustrate something about our main character. And in the case of these two younger individuals, I think that they're representing kind of two sides of this coin of youth. We have his assistant Takashi, I believe, who doesn't seem to really have much of a purpose except chasing this young woman that he fancies. But the film could have stopped there and been making a statement about generational differences, how as you age, you mature. But we see with this girl who comes back to listen to this Patti Smith tape that she is actually much more like Hirayama than we were initially led to believe. Even the first time that they're listening to this tape in the car with the assistant Takashi, you can watch Hirayama look at her to see what she's thinking and feeling and doing as this music plays. And it's evident that he looks at her and he sees that she understands the music in a way that is kind of akin to the way that he understands it. And I think that kiss at the end is a recognition of the significance of this moment that she was able to share with him, with Hirayama. And I agree that it's mostly a reaction of shock to the physical kiss, but also I think shock to this shared experience that he was not anticipating. He goes through each day not necessarily meeting folks who are viewing the world in the same way as he does. So it's a little reminder, I think, to him that he's not alone in perhaps his experience with music or his experience just with life in general.
That's a very good point. Yeah. And so then there's another connection that you talked about, which is this woman who runs a restaurant or a bar, and
Mhm.
he has a crush on her clearly, but he doesn't pursue her. But then he's going there and he sees another man in there and they're embracing. And he has a funny reaction. And then he goes and buys some coolers and he's getting himself drunk. And then the man finds him. And then the man reveals something very interesting. You want to talk about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, that whole sequence is quite fascinating. So it's evident, although it's never stated directly, that our protagonist is interested in this woman who runs the restaurant or the bar, but he's not a man of direct action. He's a man that is kind of just allowing life to operate around him. And so when he sees this embrace, he kind of leaves not knowing what to do and finds some alcohol and some cigarettes as a means of escaping, which we hadn't seen his character do. There was never any attempt to numb any sort of pain that he might be experiencing. In fact, on the surface, it might seem like he's not experiencing any pain when, of course, he is. So this man meets him down by the water, and it turns out to be the ex husband of this restaurant bar owner. And against our initial expectations, they end up bonding and playing shadow tag with one another. And this ex husband has one of my favorite lines of the film where he turns to our protagonist and he says something along the lines of, shadows, do they get darker when they overlap? And these two men kind of share in this moment of pain, but joy together in a way that we don't expect as an audience. It's quite interesting.
Yes, because the ex-husband also reveals that he's dying of cancer and he came back because he had treated her poorly and he wanted to apologize before he died. And
Hmm.
so he opens up and tells Hirayama that he's dying. And so he has his pain and Hirayama has his own pain, maybe because he can't pursue the woman for whatever reason. And so they're both just connecting on that basis. And you're right, it's like these moments of connection where first with the young woman and then with this older man, he has these connections with people that are very unique.
Hmm.
So now you mentioned earlier, you talked about the niece who shows up. She runs away from home and she leaves her parents and her mother, who is his sister, and they spend some time together. But ultimately, we find out that he must have called the sister because she shows up in her
Yes.
chauffeur driven, fancy car.
Hmm.
And we see that he has a very wealthy sister and clearly comes from an extremely wealthy family. And here he is living in a very poor neighborhood in a very shabby apartment, wearing shabby clothes, riding a broken down bike, and he's living a life of, I wouldn't say poverty, but, along the lines of
Hmm.
poverty.
Hmm.
And there's the sister. What did you make of their interaction?
Of the niece or the sister
Well,
or
first
both?
the
Yeah.
niece and then
Yeah.
the sister. Yeah.
Yeah. So the niece, Nico, all of these connections are so perfectly written and so perfectly portrayed on screen. But we see her arrive at his apartment, his home, and she notes that it was always part of her plan to visit him, to see him. And she insists on coming to work with him. She even insists on trying to help clean some toilets, although she doesn't do a brilliant job. And they sit in the park together where Hariyama takes photos of the trees every day. And she pulls out a camera, disposable, an analog camera that is something that was gifted to her by Hirayama. And we realize that, again, this is another example of other humans seeing the world the way that he sees it. And we also understand the significance that he has had in her life, he being the one who actually gifted her that camera years back that she kept. So, again, a very clear example of connection that just kind of occurs that he's not actively seeking. And then when the sister arrives, there are a couple of lines that could very easily be passed over, but actually hold pretty tremendous significance. So, as you mentioned, she's quite wealthy. She arrives with a chauffeured vehicle to pick up her daughter, and she talks about their father, who is ill. It appears to be suffering from some form of dementia. And she kind of implores him to visit his father. And she says the line, "He won't act like he used to." And that's really the only reference that we have in this film of some potential past trauma, this pain from a life that Hirayama has left behind. And the siblings really represent, I think, two ways of coping with that childhood pain, that childhood trauma. She chases this materialistic sense of fulfillment, whereas Hirayama goes in, you could argue, the very opposite direction. So, super important, again, those relationships, however small or short of a runtime they might have.
Yes, and going back to what you said about, finding kindred spirits, the niece, she's run away from home. So obviously she's not happy with aspects of her home life. And she's run to Hirayama, who she feels a connection with. And as you see them hanging out together, they have a real ease together. He's not a talker, but they're comfortable together. And she doesn't need to get him to talk. She's not trying to get him to do anything different. She's just with him, enjoying his company, and he's just with her, enjoying her company. And, he gives her a couple of days before he calls his sister.
Mhm.
And, they are obviously enjoying each other's company. So they have that kind of kindred spirit thing too. And then with the sister, it's quite the opposite. He clearly loves her,
Mhm.
but he can't go visit the dad and he can't, say more. And she says another line too. She says, "Is it true that you're cleaning toilets?"
Mhm.
And it's as though she can't believe that her brother, who grew up in the same family, the same household as she, and she's living this life of luxury, she can't believe that he has chosen to live this way and to do this job. It's almost like she knows he's doing it, but she can't
Mhm.
believe it and she
Mhm.
needs him to confirm it. It's
Mhm.
it's so unbelievable to her. And so that's, I think, a really powerful line. What did you make of that line?
Yeah, again, I think it says a lot about the way that they are viewing life and what they value. And her asking that question just reinforces how far apart they are in their view of the world, right? This idea that cleaning toilets would somehow be beneath someone that she grew up with and is related to, whereas clearly our lead does not view it in the same way. He takes pride in doing the best job that he can each day. So again, I think it just comes back to this Eastern and Western kind of view of the world and this notion of kind of dichotomy versus duality, which I think we'll talk about a little bit, but just the two sides to the coin.
It's very interesting. And then finally, you see him driving after this meeting with his sister and the mention of his father and saying goodbye to his niece. And he's having this extremely interesting reaction. He's listening to music, and, it's a music that's like everything's going to be fine, kind
Yeah,
of this,
Nina Simone, I'm feeling
Yeah.
good. Yeah.
Yeah, so everything's gonna be fine. It's like this kinda happy music, and yet he's, like, crying and then laughing and then crying and then laughing. He's kind of having this, like, emotional breakdown, breakthrough, something is happening to him, and obviously, there's a lot going on inside him, but you can't quite tell what it is because, again, it's a little bit confusing or contradictory. What did
Mhm.
you make of that reaction?
Yeah, before I even get into that, Koji Yakusho in this film as a whole, but in that scene in particular, I don't even have words for how brilliant of a performance I think this is. He won the best actor award at Cannes when the film premiered, but then didn't receive enough attention, I think, in the months following. But that scene to me is essentially a microcosm of the film's messaging as a whole. We have this man who is simultaneously experiencing so much joy and so much pain. And we, as Westerners in particular, do tend to view this as a contradiction. Well, either you're happy or you're sad. And in fact, the lines from one of the songs in the film Pale Blue Eyes by the Velvet Underground starts off with sometimes I feel so happy, sometimes I feel so sad. But really, what this is illustrating is the significance of duality versus dichotomy. It's not a happy or sad, it's not a good or bad, it's not a joy or sorrow. It's understanding that at the core of our nature as humans is all of these things. And this is a culmination and understanding for the audience that this is not a man who is always happy, despite what we might see in the film, smiling every time he opens the door in the morning, taking these beautiful photos of the trees. This is a man who also is experiencing tremendous pain. And it's not a contradiction. In fact, by allowing himself to experience both of these things, it almost heightens the other. He is not holding himself back from feeling this pain. He's allowing himself to feel it in this moment. And that makes him realize how special his life is. So instead of viewing these tears and these smiles as inherently contradictory, I think that in fact it just illustrates how important they are to one another. And it's just such a beautiful moment to me.
So you're kind of taking this spiritual take on it. I'm going to take the psychiatric take on it. So,
Sure.
which is not that different, but I was watching this guy and watching some of his choices and his particular hobbies and his life choices in terms of job and the way he is quite passive in terms of relationships. He lets people come to him, but he doesn't approach them, right? He didn't pursue his love interest. He didn't pursue talking to anybody. He hardly talks at all. So he's kind of a passive guy when it comes to interacting with people. They come to him because he's kind of enigmatic too, and they're sort of interested because he's quiet, right? He seems interesting, like all quiet people do. But I'm looking at his choices and I'm looking at his silence and his passivity and his choice of job and his kind of insular world. And I'm thinking, like I said, what's with this guy? And then with the scene with the sister, I go, okay,
Mhm.
so yeah,
Mhm.
he has trauma, as you mentioned. He has trauma and he's made some choices in terms of how he's going to deal with his trauma. And, as choices go, they're not bad choices because clearly he had some pretty significant trauma. And this was his way, his choice of how to deal with it. He's not hurting anybody. He's not causing harm. In fact, he's doing a good job cleaning those toilets. He's very kind to people. He's generous. He's thoughtful. He's a good person. He's just living this very constrained life, this very constrained existence, and he's not connecting with other human beings, right? That's, I think, maybe one of the sadder parts of his
Mhm.
choices. But, this is his choice that he's made, how to deal with his trauma. And so, of course, there's going to be some pain because, well, if you don't address it directly, it doesn't go away. It might not be as crippling, but it's not going to go away. So it doesn't look like he's addressed it, but he's managing it and he's content to live with the joy and the pain. And, as a psychiatrist, I wish he had a little bit more in his life in terms of human contact, right? In terms of people who, might be there for him if he had the need. But I do appreciate that it's not the worst way to manage trauma, considering the way that a lot of people do, especially in the West.
Mhm.
And in the East, actually, when you
Oh,
think of it. Yeah,
definitely. It's
yeah,
not again, that's
yeah,
a simplistic,
yeah.
take for sure, yeah.
Yeah. So, everywhere, addiction and violence and self-destructiveness. So there's a lot of ways that we don't handle our trauma well. And I guess
Mhm.
if we're gonna, handle it in a certain way, living like a monk is not the worst possible way to do it. That's
Yeah.
that's my thoughts about it. What do you make
Mhm.
of that?
Yeah, no, I can't say that I disagree with any of that. I think we see clearly in his day-to-day life that he is exercising autonomy and control in ways that he knows and understands is safe.
Right.
He is not willing to take those risks when it comes to connection because perhaps rooted in these childhood experiences,
Yeah.
the understanding of the pain that that can ultimately bring. And so he controls his life in the ways that he can, even if it's like, I mean, I'm a man with a mustache. I love how he trims his mustache every single morning and no one would ever notice the difference. But that's one way that he is able to have control over his life in perhaps ways that he hadn't in the past.
And now let's pause for a quick word about my other podcast. I'm Dr. Marcia Sirota. We all need to be inspired and uplifted these days. We need a good laugh and we need to be moved. In the Ruthless Compassion podcast, I speak with a wonderfully diverse group of people. They've overcome daunting obstacles and they're making unique, exciting contributions to our communities and to our world. The Ruthless Compassion podcast is at 145 episodes and counting. Why not have a listen to it today? Yeah, and I think the photographs are another way because he
Mhm.
has boxes and boxes and boxes. Every weekend he gets, a new book and he gets his roll of film developed and he collects his photos and then the photos go in a box and he has boxes and boxes and boxes in his closet. And so I think it's another way he kind of controls his environment by taking these photos and then, he just puts them in a box. It's like an interesting hobby. But I think you're right that the way he is trying to control things and order his life and make
Mhm.
it safe and make it predictable, right? When you have
Mhm.
trauma, one of the worst parts of it is the lack of control and the lack of predictability, not knowing what's going to happen. And so he has made his life safe and predictable and controlled the most a human being can do. And so he's very successful in that sense. It's just a little sad that, he has limited himself because of his trauma to not having the human interaction. He obviously takes a lot of satisfaction from his job. He
Mhm.
takes a lot of pleasure from his hobbies. The one place that's missing, obviously, is the human stuff. And that seems like the hardest thing for him to manage. That seems
Mhm.
like a hurdle he's not going to be able to overcome.
Yeah, and it's not as though he doesn't gain fulfillment from these connections too. I think
Yeah.
that's important. It's not that he does not want to connect. It is difficult, but you can see through kind of the micro expressions on Koji Yakusho's face that he really does enjoy certain moments of
Yeah.
connection, and it is fulfilling to him. And that's part of the pain that he's feeling in that scene when he's driving, that he is happy, but he understands that there are these kind of missing pieces to his life.
And perhaps he's reflecting on his past, when the sister comes back into his life for that moment and she mentions the father, it must bring
Hmm.
up memories of the things that he went through. So he's got all of the past superimposed on his very controlled presence. And I think what it also shows is that no matter how much you sort of try to put yourself in that little safe bubble, you cannot escape the past. And in
Hmm.
psychiatry, we say you have to go through the pain to get to the other side. You cannot wall yourself off from it. I think he was trying to wall himself off from it, but obviously it doesn't work that way. So he can only, create his life the way he does, and then occasionally the pain is going to
Hmm.
break through, and when it does, it really does.
Hmm. Yeah, he is clearly someone who, for these reasons or other, does not spend too much time reflecting on the past nor looking toward the future. There's so many amazing lines in this film, to be honest, but when he's chatting with his niece, he delivers her the message, now is now, next time is next time, right? Again, this kind of mentality about living in the moment, but to your point, also perhaps a little bit of avoidance, avoiding looking either behind him or ahead of him as well.
Yeah, and it's a very interesting take on this kind of notion of living in the moment, because although it's a good idea to live more in the moment, to have that mindfulness, we do need to learn from the past, and we do need to heal the past, and we also do need to anticipate the future, because we have to be prepared. We don't want to dwell on the past, we don't want to obsess about the future, but we have to consider both. And if we're too much in the present, we're kind of in this blinkered state, like those poor horses with
Yeah,
those
the
blinkers
blind.
on them.
Yeah.
And I think that's what it does. It deprives us of that perspective. And I think we need to have the past with us and the future with us while we're in the moment, not obsessively, not in a destructive way, but we have to include those things so that, his living in the present might be a little bit pathological.
Potentially, yeah.
It's spiritual, but maybe
Mhm.
maybe a little pathological.
Yeah, and again, I think that's the making of a great film is when you can view it through so many different lenses and it leads you to different interpretations that again are not necessarily contradictory but are just kind of coexisting alongside one another. There is not just one way to view the film. There are so many, an almost infinite number of ways that these moments can be interpreted.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is one of the nice things about this film. One of the other things I was thinking, I said this before, that how passive this character is. And I think it's very interesting because in a lot of films, if a character is that passive, we don't like them. We don't relate to them. We feel kind of annoyed at them, do something. But in his case, I didn't feel that way. I felt compassion for him. And the way the movie was constructed, his passivity does not feel annoying. It does not feel alienating. We're not estranged from him. We sort of understand him, even though we don't necessarily
Mhm.
understand him. But we feel a sense of compassion and empathy for him. How do you think that they did that? Like made us
Yeah.
like this very passive
Mhm.
character who doesn't connect to people on his own?
So I think part of that is some of the choices that they made when it comes to camera movement and perspective. We kind of shift back and forth between the camera being set up almost like an observer of our main character, where we are kind of a few steps removed, but then it switches to essentially the character's perspective, where the camera lingers on the sky, it lingers on these leaves, and it moves almost like his eyes would be moving. And so I think that by utilizing that sort of camera movement and perspective, it forces the audience to be looking with the character. And as a result of that, we end up, without knowing, kind of feeling or understanding the way that this character views the world. And so it's less about his passivity in those moments and more about the audience connecting with the beauty and the small things that he's observing.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thank you. That was very helpful. That really clarified things for me. Well, before we go, I just wanted to hear your last kind of words about this really remarkable film, other than to say to everyone, definitely go see it if you haven't. But what kind of last words do you have about this beautiful film, Perfect Days?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I could talk about this forever. It is really a special film to me. I think that it is a project that, as I mentioned, has so many layers and is worth viewing multiple times to kind of see through these different lenses. There are moments that are some of the most gorgeous moments in film in recent memory. There's a heavy emphasis, I'm going to mispronounce this, but on the komorebi, which is like this Japanese word that we don't have in the English language, that is for the light that filters through the trees. And so the beauty of that, the little lines of dialogue and interactions and connections when he's in the bookstore, the woman who owns the store, in response to his picking out a book by Ayakoda, says she uses the same words as we do, yet there's something so special. And I think that's essentially what this film is. It's
Right.
an everyday life doing the things that people do, but somehow all the pieces come together and create something just so special.
Well, that's a wonderful way to sum it up. And from my perspective, I think it really gives an insight into a way that a person can make a life for themselves that works, even in the face of probably quite significant trauma. And
Mhm.
it might not be a perfect life, but he can have some perfect days.
Exactly. Yeah, there you go.
Well, thank you again, Adam Manery, for coming on the Real Mental podcast. It's really been a pleasure talking with you again. And this has been, really great, because this movie really deserves to be spoken about and publicized as much as
Mhm.
possible.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I hope that more and more folks are able to see it in one way or another.
This is Dr. Marcia Sirota. Thanks for listening to the Real Mental podcast. Please leave a review and your comments wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to sign up for my free newsletter at marciasirotamd.com. While you're at it, why not check out my Ruthless Compassion podcast with over 140 episodes and counting? And if you have any ideas for guests for either Real Mental or Ruthless Compassion podcasts, please email us at info@marciasirotamd.com. Happy listening!